Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. We have a very special guest with us today. We have Marshall Roberts, and he is with the Code Read Network, and he's wearing his shirt proudly, I see. And I believe Marshall is the director there, and he has such a very interesting bio. So Marshall right now is the director of Code Read, but he also is a fifth generation farmer and he lives and works on a farm, but he also writes, he presents on the topic, and he's the father of two adult twins and stepfather to two younger girls. They each have a diagnosis for at least one specific learning disorder, SLD, and that would include dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia. So he is very close to the topic, very knowledgeable. And a friend of mine who was on this show, Harriet, who's also a teacher, sent me your article because I was not familiar with, what you did and who you are. And she said, Faith, you have to read this. And I read it and I'm like, Judy, we have to bring the Angry Farmer on. And that is your nickname, the Angry Farmer. And I'd like to know, Marshall, and our listeners would like to know, why do you call yourself the Angry Farmer?
I actually can't remember where that nickname came from. It started when I did an interview with our national broadcaster here, the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Commission. They did a story here on the farm and actually filmed us tutoring the girls. And obviously the farmer angle came into it, and I think that was actually important for people to see that this knowledge is actually already out there. It's widely available if you're willing to look for it. So just to get a basic handle on the science is very easy to do. It's not locked up. It's not hidden. It's widely available, which made me angry. The fact that it was so widely available and still we weren't seeing in a lot of the school settings. So that's where the angry bit came from, but I can't actually remember who coined it.
So it's a very interesting nickname. And the name of your article, Marshall, is, which I love, Spelling Rules or Sucks. And sucks spelled S-U-X. So Judy Boxner, my lovely co-host, when you read this article, what were your impressions of this interesting article? So Marshall is a dad. He's very familiar with the topic. As he just said, this information is out there. And yet somehow in the schools, people either don't know, I wouldn't say everyone, but people are kind of just finding out now when it is readily available. What were your impressions when you read this article, Judy?
So it made me really think about so many things. First of all, I loved when Marshall mentioned rules because, Faith, I love spelling rules. That was a big part that was missing from my literacy journey. Marshall, I don't know if you know, I was trained in reading recovery. I was a balanced literacy classroom teacher for about 15 years. And then 4 years after that, I was a reading recovery teacher in the morning. And in the afternoon, I was teaching ESL, which is now known as ENL, English as a New Language. And, I was very immersed in balanced literacy. And, it sounded like kids were reading and it sounded magical. And it wasn't that hard to teach kids to read. But what I realized was that it was a flawed system that really didn't teach kids how to decode really well. And that's why for the last 8 years of my journey, I have immersed myself in teaching kids orthographic mapping, how to decode, how to know how words work well, and so forth. But the other piece about this article that really, was something I want to dig deeper into is the speech to print approach. I know Faith talks to me about this approach pretty often. It is not my area of expertise. However, I know that, Faith has spoke highly about this approach. She's had a lot of success with it. But I also know that Faith has always told me she's not married to any program or to any approach. She's more married to pedagogy, which is similar to my mindset. So I think that there's so much to unpack. I do love spelling rules. I think they're important. I think I still can learn more about them. I think that from seeing student work samples in classrooms, I know a lot of kids, even as they're cracking the code, it doesn't always transfer into their writing as quickly and as efficiently. So it's an area I'm really passionate about, and I want to hear more about it.
So, Marshall, let's get right down and dirty. So, Judy mentioned that I do speak highly of the speech to print approach. But when I read your article, you made so many good points. And as Judy said, even though I did get training in sounds right, I still am certified in Wilson. I am OG trained. So I have a different way of looking at things. And I'm not married to a program. And you said that in your disclosure. I'm going to get this, which I thought that just got me right there. So Marshall wrote in his article, full disclosure, I am now an Orton Gillingham educator operating from a speech language pathology clinic. However, there are also Sounds Right resources. Sounds Right happens to be a program that is speech to print. So speech to print is kind of the philosophy, and Sounds Right is the program. However, there are also Sounds Right resources in the clinic, including in my own kit. I operate on a use the tools that work best for this kid's profile basis, and I'm always looking to improve my knowledge with an open mind. I am not wedded to one particular approach, paradigm, or program, and always invite correction from evidence. I want to hear you talk a little bit about that, Marshall, because you're speaking my language right there. Let's hear about how you came to this. Oh, I would definitely give Marshall big cheers for that right there.
Faith, let me just ask one thing. What do they call cheers in Australia? Is it the same thing?
A cheers is a cheers, I think. Yep. we would often do it with a glass of wine.
You're speaking our language too.
Okay.
Okay.
To start off with, I'll say that I am a director of Code Red. I'm not the director, and it's Code Red. It's not Code Read, it's Code Red. So it's a play on words. So Code Red as an emergency, which is obviously one of those confusing words. In terms of taking different things from different programs and approaches, I think you have to. I don't think there's any program or approach out there which covers off everything well enough, basically. And again, I'm really only speaking from my opinion here. I'm not representing anyone, but there are lots of programs have specific strengths. Lots of them have weaknesses, and I think provided you do actually have an understanding of why those programs are structured that way, you can actually mix and match, and you need to actually mix and match with some of them, because there are gaps to fill, and every child is unique. I mean, I'm a very big believer in the fact that the structures of our brains are very similar. Kids are remarkably similar in how they learn. We know a lot about how people learn now. We know what's required to make it happen effectively. All of those things remain the same, but we know even in the research, they're talking about item level differences, things like set for variance. One kid might be able to read a word and recognize that they've mispronounced it and find the word in their vocabulary and go, well, that's what that is. Another kid mightn't be able to do that. That level of granularity between one child and another and the background that they're bringing to the table, it all adds up to you need to try different approaches with them.
So I agree with you. And that means that teacher knowledge must be built up constantly. There needs to be constant learning because, thank you, honey. I see that cheers button. And both of us, both Judy and I, believe that it's all about teacher knowledge and that you can see the gaps if you have that knowledge and from doing the work, not just from a mantra, as you said in your article. So, Judy, in Marshall's article, I love this line, Judy, and I want to hear what you think. He said, children can't remember spelling rules? He said, this is an extraordinary claim. What is unique about spelling rules that makes them harder to remember than, say, 3 times 2 equals 6, or how to use an addition algorithm? So as a teacher, what do you think about memory? So Marshall mentioned kids with dyslexia are at a disadvantage if they're not given these types of rules. But what do you think in terms of, kids with dyslexia might have lower working memory? That's certainly very possible. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think I myself love rules. I'm a rule follower in life in general. And when I'm presented with rules, that's very soothing to me. And I find that rules in classrooms can be very helpful to kids. Like, the other day I was reviewing the C and the K rule, and I think it's a complicated rule for a lot of kids. But once I explained it to some of the kids that were actually struggling, this was a group of tier 2 kids that were getting additional support. They didn't do that well on their initial assessment in phonics. And once I presented it to them, they really got it way quicker than I thought that they would get it. So I think, I don't think we could lump kids into like one category that rules are easy for everybody. And I think that sometimes we'll have to present rules multiple times to kids in order for them to become solid. I do, however, know that with one particular program that I work with, which is, Faith, can I name the program? Or should I not name the program? Foundations. So years ago, I was completely obsessed. This was everything to me. And now after doing it for many years, I could see the pros, the cons, the good, the bad, like every other program. But it has a portion that's called the marking portion. And in the marking portion, we're marking words, we're marking the digraphs, we're marking the blend, we're putting a brev or a breve over the short vowel, we're putting a macron for the long sounds. I think that's everything. I think it helps with metacognition. I think it helps with understanding the way words work. However, some teachers didn't fully buy into it. So I think that affects data if teachers don't fully understand what the purpose of some of these rules and teachings are. But I think for some of the kids, it could be a bit much. That's why I don't say give up. I have different scaffolds that I throw in. Like, you can't mark a word that's, for instance, picture a kid spells a word wrong, right? If they write the word such, and instead of writing such, they put an SH at the end. You're not going to mark the digraph correctly or whatever because you didn't write the right digraph possibly or something like that. So a scaffold could be, okay, I'm going to spell all the words correctly, collect your papers, spell all the words correctly, and now I'm going to ask you to mark it up. So I'm trying to think a little bit outside the box on how to make kids more successful. But at the end of the day, I still think that there may be kids that it may take into overload. And that's why Faith has pushed my thinking a little bit with not being overly attached to syllable types, although she knows I deeply love syllable types in correlation with spelling. but something known as vowel flexing. And now I really encourage that. So at the beginning of the year, even when we didn't teach kids all the syllable types, I show teachers, okay, let's show the brev and the macron so kids know how to do vowel flexing right from the beginning. And sometimes in a book, I'll just make that one little symbol instead of talking about like the Orton Gillingham way of drawing the bridge, which I do also because I'm trained in Orton Gillingham. So I think what I'm trying to say is I think that there's value in rules. I think many kids can handle it. I think many teachers can handle it as well. But I think, as Marshall was saying, we still have to be a little bit flexible to know our audience and to, you know, push our thinking to be a little bit flexible. And that's an area I'm pushing myself to continue to grow in.
So, Marshall, I just read that little piece of your blog out loud to Judy. Could you kind of talk about why you compared this to, let's say, a math fact in terms of memorization? Are you trying to say that if they could memorize their math facts, there's no reason they can't learn spelling rules?
Yes, and I guess what I didn't make explicit that early on in the piece is that I was actually looking at the underlying philosophy behind phonographics, which then led on to sounds right. So Piaget was quite convinced that kids between 2 and 7-ish couldn't actually work with logical structures. So they were more looking at symbols and pictures, and that was the kind of thinking that they work with. So to introduce something that is rule-based is too logical for them, and I think that's probably where most of the resistance to spelling rules comes from in some speech-to-print programs. And I think, well, I don't think, we know very well now that that's actually not true. Kids can think logically, they can learn logical rules, and they actually can even learn them unconsciously. So we know, for example, that kids actually start to pick up spelling patterns even before they can actually read. So they're sensitive to the print even before they can read the print. So yeah, we know that kids can learn logical structures and logical rules, and we do teach them maths. We do teach them how to do simple additions and so on. So yeah, what I'm saying is, it's to make a blanket statement that kids can't learn spelling rules is quite incredible. It's something that really needs to be examined. I mean, if there's proof for that, for sure, prove me wrong. But it seems to me that it's very strongly on the opposite side of the fence. They can.
So in the article, you actually quoted John Walker, director of Sounds Right. And John said, and by the way, I know John very well. So I was trained in Sounds Right, and I brought it to a Long Island district here. And I want to talk about that in terms of working with a district, bringing a program in, but also understanding that as kids, certainly as they get older, when you start getting into the advanced code level with vowel teams, that, you know, spelling is an issue. And we need to look at it, but I'm going to circle back to that. I want to just pull out the quote. You said, sadly, this is what John said, rather. Sadly, no one knows what the spelling rules are. And if there's one thing I've learned in all my years of teaching, it's that most children can't learn and apply even the simplest of rules. And then you went on to say that, I guess this was a follow-up to that, right? And where he was asked about that again. And he said, forget rules. And I won't read the whole thing, but he said that basically it requires a lot of exposure. Relax, it will come. And you pulled that out and you answered in the article. I'll say up front that I try to avoid the word rule when I'm teaching. I call them spelling patterns or conventions. I'll use terms interchangeably here. And I just want to say, Marshall, I avoid the word as well, but I do expose kids to generalizations. And any children I have worked with in the past, whether it's classroom teaching or tutoring or working with teachers, I talk about what's most common that can happen and what is least common. And I will show actually comparisons of words and talk about that with kids, what they're noticing and what do you see happening most often and what could you say about it? As you mentioned, the V at the end of the word, when you hear the sound V, is not going to be the letter V by itself, right? So that actually is a spelling rule, but I don't call it a spelling rule. I'll say, what do you notice here? And that's a generalization, which I think that's what you're trying to say here. Maybe we use different terminology, but bringing up what happens most often and, and something that doesn't occur very often is something that is important for kids to recognize and try to hold on to. And there's nothing wrong with it, but not necessarily forcing the issue to memorize a rule. What are your thoughts about that?
Definitely with spelling rules. The main reason I don't call them rules is because I was actually when I was trained in Orton Gillingham, the trainer made a very wise statement. She said, if you use the word rules, you're setting yourself up for disaster, especially with kids on the autism spectrum, because as soon as they find one that breaks the rule, as you said, it was a rule. So yeah, a lot of the rules are broken. They have exceptions there, and as you say, it's more about occurrences, statistical occurrences, and what happens more regularly than others. But there are some that are pretty solid. They're very few and far between, the ones that you can't nail down to a rule. So Judy mentioned the word such. I'd actually treat that as an irregular word because it doesn't follow the TCH at the end of the word. So yeah, I think and that's really what it comes down to. It's we're enabling kids to switch on that statistical learning, a lot of the self-teaching of actually recognizing patterns and starting to notice what's actually happening in the orthography.
So, like I said, I know John, and I have to tell you that I think that if John heard something like that, I think he would believe what you're saying. I think he would agree with that. And I know the way it comes off from the quote as if it might sound like, well, this, forget the rules, because I don't think he agrees with that terminology in teaching a rule. But I think John would agree that if you pointed out that something like this happens often enough, I think he would agree with that. And I don't want to speak for John, but I do think that he could be quite reasonable. And even though it's his program, I think that something like that he would agree with. I don't know.
We come back to the "don't worry, it will come" idea. I can't hear you, Faith.
Yes, let's talk about that, because that relax, it will come is a dangerous.
That really bothers me. That's like I spoke about on a previous episode when I was venting. I think it was in a teacher's room. I was venting to a school aide a couple of years ago, and it was a crisis. Most of our second graders at that particular site, at that particular school, we probably had 75% of the kids not reading. And my heart was literally hurting and I was in pain and I felt like crying. And all of a sudden, the school aide, who I actually admire, she's now retired, God bless her, but she said, don't worry, God will help them. Everything will be okay. And it really bothered me because I knew that the reality is that that's probably, I don't know. I don't think that was the solution. I think we have to help our kids and we can't put that responsibility on, religious figures. We have to do what we can within the classroom. I mean, even if you believe in faith, I think that that's the problem with education sometimes, is that we will just either give up or deflect or say it's somebody else's responsibility. But I think that that's a very, very dangerous concept. And to give another example, I'm currently working with some students that are actually in accelerated programs. They're actually thriving. And very often I'll see writing samples. A lot of those students will come for me to see me, not for reading instruction, but for writing instruction. And I will be honest with you, a lot of the spelling that I see is actually atrocious. And it's so concerning that these kids are in quote unquote accelerated classes, but they clearly didn't get any instruction on the rules. A lot of these kids were in classrooms that were in schools that claim to be aligned with the science of reading, but are still very much ingrained with Lucy Calkins's reading and writing workshop. They have elements of the science. They have some Hegarty. They have a little sprinkle of foundations. They have a little Lexia learning. But let me tell you, the writing samples that I'm seeing are atrocious. And it makes me wonder how much these kids may have benefited from strong spelling instruction. And what should we do now? Is it too late? These kids are now going into third grade and fourth grade and fifth grade. Are we just going to rely on, Google and all the tools and all the AI features, or are we going to get this right?
So Marshall, Judy mentioned third grade, fourth grade. There does get to there's a point where we have to start thinking, as they get older, certainly couldn't they handle this information? Maybe some very young children, it will go in one ear out the other. But as they get older, you would think there's a point in time where that should be emphasized. What is your idea in terms of age in this? Do you think that perhaps speech to print could be effective, since you do have a background in it, right? You are trained in many different approaches. Do you think that, as far as being an efficient way to teach reading from the start, that kids pick it up faster and then maybe focus a little bit on spelling generalizations as you go, especially as you get older? What are some of your thoughts about that?
Okay. Firstly, the quote that you read last of all, the forget rules one, as far as I know, that wasn't John Walker. That was whoever's administering the Facebook page, the Sounds Right Australia Facebook page. So that may well not have been John Walker. I have no idea who actually made that quote. The one that I have attributed to John definitely was John. That was from one of his blog posts. Secondly, I'm not Sounds Right trained. I have Sound Right stuff in my kit, in terms of like the little cards with the phonemes matched up with the sounds. The graphemes matched up with the phonemes. And in terms of age, I'm working mostly with kind of grade 3 above, and spelling rules are definitely doable at that age. I would say I'd be keen to introduce them as soon as possible, just in terms of the plasticity of the brain and the learning, and then that feeding back into reading ability as well, and reading ability feeding back into spelling ability. Basically, I actually focus more on spelling with a lot of my kids, because the reading is actually moving quite nicely, and it's the spelling that's quite far behind, it seems to me. And I find with focusing on the spelling, the reading almost takes care of itself. We do reading. It's not like we don't do it, but I find from a more intensive focus on spelling, the reading takes off as well.
So, I'm looking at your article, and in that same paragraph, you said, unless I and thousands of other practitioners and researchers live in an alternate universe to John Walker, so you said him by name, this must surely be hyperbole and not the kind of stuff on which you want to base pedagogical decisions. So I assumed that you were attributing this to John Walker.
No, that the hyperbole I'm talking about there is that kids can't learn spelling rules.
Okay, all right. Because it seemed to me that it was attributed to him. Regardless, don't you think then, since you were not trained in sounds, right, that maybe if you had the training in the program, that perhaps there is something that some teachers can work around and get success from that program, especially since, I think, look, in all fairness to the program, without having knowledge in terms of the actual training and going through the process and using it, that maybe, you would think differently, perhaps. And I'm not saying that what you're saying here is incorrect. I'm just saying, couldn't that influence some of your thoughts if you did have the training? Because I know myself that if I'm talking about something, I want to be fully immersed in something before I make a decision about it.
Definitely. I would definitely take that on board. It's quite likely that it could change my thinking. I doubt it would change my thinking on the kind of language that's being used in that kind of forum, though. That, to me, is a very strong position. And I mean, I remember your interview with Lyn Stone, where you were tic-tacking about the speech-to-print approach. And I think you were largely actually in agreement, but what was happening was you were saying it's okay because a knowledgeable teacher can take this and apply this, and where this needs to happen, we'll go here and we'll do this. Whereas I think Lyn's objection was that there are some programs which actively discourage you against that because they treat that as not doing the program with fidelity, for example. And I think that is an important issue. So the way I look at it is, in an ideal world, if all educators were very knowledgeable, you wouldn't actually need a program. Other than having the resources at hand, you would have the knowledge and you would be able to do this, and this. At the moment, we're in a bit of a crossroads where we're kind of getting the knowledge on board. We still need a bit of scaffolding for us as educators, and that's where a program is very useful. But if a program then says, don't use any other resources or don't use any other form of pedagogy to fill these gaps in our program, then that is problematic. And I totally agree that if I did Sounds Right training, I might actually say this is actually, and I actually believe that it is a very strong program. I mean, from what I've heard from people who are trained, I believe it's a very strong program. And the whole idea of going speech to print first makes an enormous amount of sense. But on that point, on not teaching spelling rules and drawing a hard line on not teaching spelling rules, to me, that's kicking out a crutch.
I just
Wow.
that.
Can we give him a cheers button?
I was just saying, you know what?
Question. I know you probably have a lot to say about that, but I want to ask you a little bit. So, as you know, I'm not an expert. First of all, I'm not an expert in anything. I'm just passionate. But anyway, I'm definitely not as familiar with the speech to print approach as I want to be. So tell me, what does it look like in terms of spelling for early learners and for later learners in terms of what you're seeing in the field? Because this is what you do pretty often right now. So can you tell us a little bit about what the spelling's looking like? Is it looking good? Is it looking strong? What are the writing samples looking like? I want to hear a little bit from you.
Are you asking me or are you asking Marshall?
You.
Okay, so I could tell you, and Judy, you saw the writing samples that we had. I'm working with a district here on Long Island. We did a presentation, and you saw the K1 writing samples, and they were phenomenal, and the spelling was fabulous. But that's the initial code, more when it's a one-to-one match. As kids get older and they have to know different spellings for one sound, you know, spelling definitely gets a little harder. It's a little tricky. And I do think that, to Marshall's point, that as kids start really understanding what they say and putting it down on paper, there is conventional spelling, not just that you're going to use invented spelling by matching letters to sounds, that it's going to get a little bit more difficult. And bringing in those generalizations can definitely help all learners, whether they have difficulties or not. So in answer to your question, Judy, I think the early writing samples will definitely look very strong in the early.
And you don't think that they look strong also because you're passionate about writing?
I didn't say that. For some, the kids who are on the right track will definitely pick it up because they have more of an internal understanding of orthographic mapping, right? But the kids who are on, who struggle, I do think for them that some of them will not just pick it up. And I do think that whole idea of just relax and wait and see what happens, it'll happen through exposure. I don't necessarily agree with that. And that's why I have my own opinions. I'm not married to any program.
I want to ask you another question. So what age group does the program that you work with go until? Like what age group is it geared towards?
You can use it for children as young as 4 years old, 4 or 5.
And as old as?
Well, again, if they are struggling readers, you can use it for older readers. I could tell you from my own experience, I do use a speech to print with older kids, but I use my knowledge of OG and I do things as a professional. And what Marshall said, you could really take any program and toss it if you know what you're doing. So, and that comes with experience. So here's what I think, Marshall. You tell me what you think. You mentioned fidelity. Don't you think when someone is learning a program that it is important to stay true to it until they could see the gaps, and then as they learn, then they could loosen up a little? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think and that's where the training is so important, because then you can actually get an understanding of why it's structured that way, maybe even why the scope and sequence is in that particular order, and yeah, looping back to the research and seeing how it all hangs together. I think you know, I would certainly not encourage people to just grab from here and here and here and here unless there's, you know, they've got a strong research base for doing that. I think, you know, obviously if they're finding problems with the kids progressing, then the first thing, I mean, in my instance, what I do if a kid's not progressing, I look at my own self first and say, well, what am I actually doing here? A bit of task analysis. What is it about this task that is presenting particular challenges to the kid? Is what I'm delivering to them kind of got enough scaffolding for those challenges? Has it had too much in the past and they haven't had enough of that release of responsibility? Just kind of making those decisions as you go along. But definitely, I mean, fidelity, especially with a program that's been developed on, you know, clinical research. There's and especially if it's something like direct instruction, you know, you don't want to be mucking around with, if you've got a program like Spelling Mastery, you don't want to be pulling something in from somewhere else. That's a script, which is that is effectively, it's like a scientific experiment. These are the ingredients you're putting into this step by step, and there's research behind all of those steps. There's research behind why we repeat it next lesson. Don't cross out a page because you've already taught it last lesson. Please don't do that. Obviously fidelity is important, and particularly with the more heavily scripted stuff.
So Judy, Marshall mentioned Lyn Stone, and he was referring to her article, Culty is Charged, right? And when we brought Lyn on, we had a discussion about the culty behavior when people are just kind of married to an approach. And as you saw, you know, Lyn and I agreed on many, many points that she mentioned. You know, in looking at Marshall's article and thinking about our interview with Lyn, do you think that perhaps that other people out there are also getting this message that, you know, if you are, let's say, a sounds right trainer or a sounds right practitioner, or a Wilson, I'm going to mention other names, a Wilson practitioner or OG practitioner, or a reading recovery teacher, I don't care what it is, that it somehow prevents logical thinking, like kind of reasonable thinking along the way, that if, you know, you have this program that maybe it blocks logic sometimes. What are your thoughts?
I think it's completely dangerous to be married to a program. I was for a long time married to reading recovery. I was that person. I believed in it more than anything in my body and soul. I woke up in the morning, I thought about reading recovery. I went to sleep, I thought about my running records. And does that mean I was a bad person? No. I loved those kids. And I really, from the bottom of my heart, thought at that time that I was doing what was best for kids. And in many ways, like I said, I don't regret any of my learning. I think that there were some fundamental flaws, but I still think it brought me to where I should be today. But I will no longer fall into that trap, even now in the structured literacy world, where I'll be closed-minded and say this is the only way that's going to work, or it's foundations, or that's it, or it's UFLI, or that's it. But I think that the dangerous thing is that there are a lot of people that do still seem married to different programs. And I think that there is a danger even within the SOR movement of becoming culty again. And I think the problem with a lot of this is that a lot of people are just giving their opinions rather than getting down and dirty and learning about these different, you know, approaches and methods. And I think that, you know, it's important to stay open-minded. Like even the other day, my boss sent me to an additional training. And then the first thing that came to my mind is like, how many more different things can I learn? I went to a PAF training. And a lot of it was very similar to the stuff that I know already from Orton Gillingham and Foundations. But I think that it's very important because there were some good things that I learned during that training as well. There was a lot of connected text, more than I've ever seen. So I think we have to really remain open-minded and not married to certain things. And I think that a lot of our experiences should come more from actual research and data rather than just our opinions. Because I think if we just get tied to opinions, we fall into the same predicaments we did during the balanced literacy era, to be quite honest.
Good points. Good points, Judy. So Marshall, I don't know if you're familiar with a program, Wilson, but it's a program based on the OG philosophy, right? And it has rules and syllable types, and there's structure to it. There's a sequence. But what I did notice, and I am certified in Wilson, but here's some of the flaws that I see, that some kids will stay stuck in these lower levels for a very long time because they have the impression that they can't move on because of spelling or because of nonsense word reading or something like that that's holding them back. And, I could see that sometimes they're in Wilson for 3 years, 4 years, sometimes more. And that's not an efficient use of time in my mind. And I do think what's holding some of these kids back and what teachers seem to believe is that they cannot leave and move on because some of these things are holding them back and because spelling doesn't move as rapidly as the reading does. As you said, that if they know the spelling, the reading kind of takes off because they're remembering the orthographic patterns. So, any thoughts on that?
I certainly wouldn't hold kids back from reading more deeply on the basis of their spelling. I think, I actually had this little pet theory going on in my head for a while that a definition of dyslexia could actually be more focused on spelling ability than reading ability, because a lot of the dyslexic kids I work with, their reading is actually quite sound. It's good enough to get them by, whereas their spelling is all over the place. It's particularly those who have low orthographic processing. These are the kids that you can write something 4 ways and they won't be able to give you a good indication of which one looks better, or one might not even look better to them at all. As far as they're concerned, it's a random choice. But they'll be able to read the words. Since seeing that study that came out recently from Tryman and others, I think that's probably a bit of a case of my own bias coming in there. I think it's probably just a case of those kids are more reflecting what happens in typical development, but at a later age. So dyslexic kids are basically reading ahead of where they're spelling, but that's typical. And that's probably a bias from me because I don't work with I'm not working with the kinder and grade 1 kids, so I haven't had any exposure there to see how that normally unfolds. But yeah, in terms of holding them back, the slogan we use in our clinic is move as fast as you can, as slow as you must. So you push, you jam that information in as quickly as you can, but if it's not sticking, you circle back and you go over it. But from what I'm seeing with my kids, once you get that explicit instruction happening, everybody progresses. There's always some progress there. You shouldn't need to be sitting in the same spot for 6 months or a year even. That sounds a little bit crazy to me. I don't know Wilson, but that sounds a little bit weird.
I have to say, Marshall, it happens all the time. I have a lot of kids over the years where they were getting Wilson in school, and then parents would bring them to me for private tutoring. And so it wasn't like they weren't getting structured literacy somewhere as an intervention, but parents would say, I don't know, they're still on CVC type words or, short vowels. And this has been X number of years and they haven't progressed. So this happens all the time. And you did mention that, K1 is not really where you're at. You're working, I guess, with the older kids. But there's a big difference in working with younger kids. And I would say that if I were you, I would look at speech to print a little bit closer so that you could have some experience with that. And it would make you probably well-rounded in terms of really honing in on what the gaps are. And I know you could recognize it clearly. You're a smart person. I could tell by the article that you have that experience, that hands-on working knowledge to be able to formulate these opinions. But I would recommend, and it doesn't have to be Sounds Right, but some speech to print program to get to really know very well, especially if you plan on working with younger children. I do think it would be helpful. Judy, any last thoughts or questions for Marshall?
What motivated you most to write this article? Like, where did it come from? This is not the first topic I wake up in the morning thinking about, because I haven't been trained in speech to print. What motivated you most to delve into this topic? I kind of sometimes will avoid topics that I'm not as familiar with, and I'll shut down a little bit. But what motivated you?
It's becoming a very popular program here, and to the point that I'm hearing on the grapevine that some of our dyslexia associations won't even list tutors unless they've done the speech to print training. So and even a particular program within that. So that's a little bit of a concern, coming from the kind of dyslexia advocacy background, because I think for dyslexics in particular, the spelling rules can be a real godsend. So yeah, that was the main thrust of it for me. And I actually do wake up in the morning thinking of this stuff. And so can I just read you a passage from this is the book called The Science of Reading. This is the first edition. I have the second edition as well. But you will probably be familiar with Connie Jewell's quote about explicit instruction being helpful for all, crucial for some, harmful for none. On the very same page as that sentence, we have this one: when engaged in face-to-face conversations, adherents of different sides in the reading wars can in fact be shamed into admitting that they agree on almost everything. And I think that's probably something that gets overlooked a lot. But with those kind of very, very hard line attitudes, that's where I think, you do actually have to stand up and make a bit of a noise about it.
And I would agree with you, Marshall, 100%. I mean, looking at your title, Spelling Rules or Sucks, spelled S-U-X, and you could see how a kid would spell sucks if they did not know and understand that the base word of that is suck and put an S on it. So I think that, what makes sucks different from tux, right? A tux, if they only go by sound. And so there is a place for this. I agree with you 100%. And I would encourage everyone to read the article and to take a look at what Marshall is saying here. But at the same time, I would encourage everyone not to condemn the approach, because it does have a lot of value. It did not get, I could tell you firsthand that I've changed kids' lives from using it. Kids where they've had, print first and it wasn't working for them and it was taking a very long time. But I think I know enough to be able to marry the approaches and make it work based on my experience. And that's what I'd like to impart to people listening, that the more you know, the longer you're at it, hands-on working with kids, not just people who talk about reading. Like you see a lot of that. A lot of people do a lot of talking. But once you dig into this and you really look at kids, that's when you start to see what we see, the people who do the work in the trenches. Marshall, any last words, any last thoughts? Because this was great.
No, I think that's probably covered me off. I'd just like to say happy Dyslexia Awareness Month for October. And thank you very much for having me on.
And it was a pleasure. And yes, this is being recorded in October. It might not be released in October. As a matter of fact, I don't think it will be. But certainly we do celebrate that. And for October, I don't know if you know, we're really focused on adolescent literacy on the Literacy View. So we have, some special guests on for that. And for those of you who are interested in the episode we had with Lyn Stone, I don't know the number offhand, but it is based on her article, Culty is Charged, and it got a lot of attention. And lastly, something I forgot to say, that on Facebook, whether it's people who are very much against speech to print or are very much for it, what I've seen is people don't even want to have this discussion that we're having. And I'm sure people are going to be very angry at me that I am kind of not towing the party line, but I don't believe in that. I believe in that's how we grow and we learn. So I would encourage people, if you are on Facebook groups, please, please, please don't get sucked into this idea that you can't have success with one and not with the other. I want to leave people with that message. So thank you, everyone. Judy wants to.
All right. All right, so I'm giving Faith the cheers, and I'm also asking everybody, follow us on our Facebook group and join us, the Literacy View, Real Teachers Letting Loose. Make sure you share our episodes with your friends, share it in all your groups. Also, now you can advertise with the Literacy View. Go to theliteracyview.com to do that. And also, if you like the work we're doing, please donate to the Literacy View. All the details are on theliteracyview.com. Thank you. We're changing lives one view at a time.
Thank you. Thanks again, Marshall.